As we enter a very volatile component of human history in 2025, where we have income inequality at record levels, even greater than the monarchs in Europe, where we had the French Revolution, we see that potentially there's a new way to frame economics. And one of the ways to frame economics is this concept of heterodox economic foundations. And this ties into how the European Union can develop a tech independent strategy from America and potentially even build a better ecosystem for technology than America. Let's start with the idea of the GDP being the primary success metric. One of the problems with the GDP is if there are people with $100 billion and there's people with $1,000 and there's 99% of the population is in poverty, what good is GDP? GDP potentially could mask many other problems that are happening with society. And we see over the last 50 years in America, the income inequality has risen to a level that the majority of people are living paycheck to paycheck and they don't have health care, and education puts them in debt. There's some real problems, and GDP is a very poor metric. Human dignity would be a better metric for economic decision making. Also, the planet, and also looking at the commons. Like, are we abusing the common, or are we keeping the commons? And some of the things that we could look at would be to look at care work, for example, teaching, firefighting, police, social work. How do we value those in terms of the impact to society? Because not everything goes into dollars and cents. So we need to look at donut economics, right? Where we can look at a multidimensional inequality measurement beyond just income and wealth. So a few different things to think about in driving this would be, for example, why is it that the American population lives many years less than the European population or Japan? Part of it potentially is the food, also the medical system. There's all these reasons why life expectancy is shorter. Could that be one of the key drivers? Instead of GDP, we care about life expectancy. Also, education. If we look at education, that could be a driver for heterodox economics, and also democracy, and also income inequality. These are drivers that potentially Europe could look at in terms of building a competing infrastructure with the United States. Now, let's first look at some of the nuts and bolts, though, as well. One of them would be a digital infrastructure autonomy. So we see that European cloud infrastructure could potentially be a huge win. And part of that is that there's a lack of trust with America. And so Europe could start to build their own cloud. And that cloud could use open source technology, and public institutions could get more involved with cloud computing. Also, local semiconductor production could be one. And then also network infrastructure resilience without US controlled choke points. We also could think about how we could use income redistribution via tech regulation. So digital services could be taxed. Also, market concentration could be an element. So if you're a $1 trillion company, you're taxed at a higher rate than if you're a $1 million company. Also, the labor share could be one of the components as well. How much of the profit are you sharing to the labor? And we arrange the taxes that way. And also, how could you build a ecosystem so that you encourage smaller companies versus larger companies? A next category for health data would be sovereignty. So could patient data live inside of the region you're in? Could there be indigenous medical technology? Could health AI systems be trained on European controlled data set? And what are the ways to differentiate yourself from the American system of capitalistic healthcare versus social healthcare? Another category for technology independence would be to look at agriculture. So could you develop specific farming technology with European research? Look at ways that farms can be managed in a European manner, maybe co-op, and also how could rural connectivity lead to smarter farming applications? Also, information ecosystem control. one of the problems with using American big tech is that they can change the rules overnight. One week they're DEI, the next week they're converging on fascism. How do you actually have content moderation that applies to the standards and the democratic best practices of the European Union? One of the ways is that you have your own control, and potentially the way to do that is to have news content be publicly funded, to prioritize information over disinformation, and also to tax organizations that are spreading disinformation. Another component to think about would be democratic technology governance. So, could you measure the impact of algorithms and assess how those are impacting the population? And that could be a component of human rights, also a component of heterodox economics. Is, are algorithms causing offline harm? Are they, causing misinformation that causes riots or lack of democracy, or spreading far-right methodology? And could you actually create a digital rights enforcement mechanism to encourage the democratic process? Another one is this mobile data sovereignty. So public transportation data could be owned by European cities. Vehicle data could be forced to be localized. Autonomous vehicles could have to be really forced to use a European component. And then also you could think about taxation. So could you tax technological independence? So if you're depending on a US vendor, you have a higher tax. If you're using a European technical standard, you have a lower tax rate. Could you build strategic technology sectors that are getting preferential tax treatment? Also, climate, right? Are you looking at renewable energy management, carbon accounting tools? What are ways that you can really prioritize your economy around climate technology? So, in a nutshell, I think what's really interesting about looking at America, looking at the last 50 years, did GDP and this classical economic way of measuring success, did it lead to good outcomes? Are the majority of Americans doing well, or the majority of Americans doing poorly? I think if you look at it from a data science perspective, I think the majority of Americans are doing worse than they were 50 years ago. Part of that is due to income inequality. So by Europe looking at the last 50 years of America and essentially randomizing it and reorganizing a new economic framework where human rights is prioritized, democracy is prioritized, carbon footprint is prioritized, there could be a very compelling case for why some of the smartest and most accomplished Americans moved to Europe. And I think that's really the story, is that when you hear leaders of America say things like, if you're complaining about America all the time, just get out. I've heard that from toxic companies I've worked at before. And typically that's the beginning of when people start to leave the country. So likewise, could Europe make the educational ecosystem, the health ecosystem, the income ecosystem with strong wealth tax, and also the carbon footprint ecosystem really compelling for the smartest people in the world, people that are motivated, so that it becomes a center, really a nexus for innovation. And innovation wouldn't be really measured by the measurements that we've used for the last 50 years of the United States of GDP, but quality of life, democracy, and human rights. And I think that's really the way forward for Europe in 2025, is to look at America and look at the mistakes that were made in terms of the tech industry, in terms of democracy, and how could you compete by doing a better version of that. Likewise, when you hear about the complaints of regulation and too much regulation, really that's a code word for violation of human rights. Anytime you hear an American venture capitalist or tech company talk about how Europe has too much regulation, what they're really saying is people have too many human rights in Europe. And really that's a nonsense argument. And the way to argue that is to say, look, why is it that people in America live less long? Why is it that the number one cause of bankruptcy is medical care? And also, why is it that the number one cause of death for children 0 to 18 is guns? That's actually failure. That's what failure looks like. What success looks like is human rights, caring for the environment, thoughtfully building things, being innovative, but also deterministic about not just relying on American technology companies that are really building toxic solutions and dropping dynamite in a hole, collecting the minerals, and then walking away instead of extracting things. How can Europe build things? And I think that's the way to compete in the coming century.